So hello. Today we are going to be talking about work ethic, and how that feeds into or supports the aesthetic of success. So I've been doing a series of commentary videos about the kind of rise of prevalence of the word aesthetic and how I think that sort of ties into broader cultural themes, where I think we are seeing increasingly, supported by the rise of social media, a huge premium on the way something looks or the way something is coming off versus some of the underlying substance. Today, really what I want to do is talk about, is work ethical? Is work ethic, having a hard work ethic, good? But I thought that this would tie in well to another aesthetic video that I wanted to do, which is sort of the optics of success, what we think success looks like. But part of the reason why I wanted to talk about work is that ultimately I want to do a video about the rise of leftism in the US in the last decade, because I mean, I'm obviously an American and I can only speak from an American point of view, but we are a very center-right country in general. And I think it's really interesting how I think with particularly the younger generations, leftism, actual leftism, is starting to become a thing, at least center left, if not truly left, on the political spectrum, kind of how that has had a resurgence in the last decade, why I think that is, etc., and sort of my own relationship with that. But as I was thinking through some of the things I'd like to talk about in that video, one of the things that came up as I was sort of evaluating my own relationship with that brand of politics and how I identify a lot more with it, I realized that this whole motto that I think has sort of arisen with Gen Z of "I do not aspire to labor" as sort of a transgressive response to what do you want to be when you grow up, just kind of exploring why that feels so resonant to me, but also so transgressive. And I realized that one of the sort of core underlying cultural presuppositions that I don't know that I cognitively agree with, but that I sort of have this intrinsic, emotional, intuitive response of support towards, is this idea that working hard is something good. Working is something that you should aspire to, and if you don't, you need to feel apologetic for that in some sense, that work is a virtue. So I thought before I did a full video kind of setting the table here for you guys, I have a future video I want to do, and I think this topic ties into the aesthetic series that I've been kind of working on over the last however many months. So we're gonna bring those together today to talk about, is work or hard work something that is good, bad, or neutral? I bet you can guess where I'm going with this, but that's sort of my kind of underlying question and the thing I'd like to sort of tease out in this video. So lucky for me, there's also a very memeable clip of that ubiquitous cultural figure Kim Kardashian going around right now that ties in very nicely to this topic and kind of is a nice segue into exploring some of the things that I want to talk about.
I have the best advice for women in business. Get your fucking ass up and work. It seems like nobody wants to work these days.
That's so true.
You have to surround yourself with people that want to work.
So why did this clip rub people so the wrong way? Well, first of all, obviously that clip of this very wealthy white woman who, yes, has worked for her money to some degree, is completely tone deaf of all of the things that were set up in her life to put her in the position to be able to have her hard work yield the amount of fruit that it has in her life. So there's this sort of tone deafness of what the result of her hard work can translate to, as opposed to what the fruits of the hard work of Joe Schmo can result in. It's also something that's like really ignoring the kind of realities of the current work landscape, because there's a huge transition here in the US, and I think that this is probably true in many countries, of the kind of work that is valued and the kind of positions that are open, where there has historically been a certain kind of labor that you could do and result in a pretty decent life through hard work that is just eroding. And so this idea that any kind of hard work will result in bountiful fortunes is pretty tone deaf as well. And then the amount of time and debt that is often required in the US to obtain the kind of credentialing that is required to get a job that you can work hard at and then make a lot of money from it is another element. Basically, it's just very tone deaf to the kind of big labor shifts that are happening here in the US, the kind of jobs that are available. I think particularly after the pandemic and how it was very pointedly revealed to a lot of us which jobs in society are truly essential versus which ones are superfluous, and the discrepancy in how those people are compensated has been a very stark reality in the overall job landscape. And it also it rings so false. I think that basically what this embodies is a reminder of how hollow this performative version of success that the Kardashians enact or embody, just like how hollow it is. I think what she's trying to communicate is this idea of ethical success. And what does ethical success look like? Well, this gets into the aesthetics piece of this. So I think that what aspirational idea of success looks like that the Kardashians maybe, well, I don't think they created this, but they're certainly perpetuators or popularizers of this kind of vibe. And that is both having this opulence and luxurious, leisure-filled life while simultaneously being on your grind, having a bunch of businesses, being your own business owner, being very successful and working hard for the leisure that you then enjoy. And before we even start to define that more, I think that it's also just interesting and fascinating to note that somebody in her position in the 2020s feels the need to perform this kind of version of success that includes a component of a lot of hard work. Because if you look historically, the flex of being rich is that you are above having to labor so hard, right? Like the whole point of accumulating wealth is to not work. And yet, particularly here in the US, and because we are the hub of a lot of sort of global culture, this I think extends likely to other countries as well, there is this idea that it is not desirable to purely have a leisure-filled life. There's this idea that the flex is having it all. The flex is having all of this leisure and luxury, but also being somebody who has worked really hard and continues to work hard, but in a very specific way. But I do think it's important to ground that notion of success or what hard work should look like in the historical reality, which I think that both of these books, Laziness Does Not Exist and Work Won't Love You Back, do a good job of sort of reminding us that in the not so distant past, the robber barons, the Gilded Age, the aristocracy, the landed gentry, all of those folks, like their whole goal was to not work, to have these very opulent, lazy, one might even say, but at the time probably originally would have been described as slothful life. Like that was the goal. But in the US at least, because we have had this history of really being rooted in the Protestant work ethic going all the way back to the Pilgrims, and I talked about that I think in my Scientology video, so I'll try to remember to link that somewhere, but the Protestant work ethic and the fact that the US was founded during the rise of capitalism, so we really haven't had a sort of economic order outside of capitalism in the US. So I think that is part of what's interesting about our perceptions of work that have arisen, because we don't have these sort of legacy economic systems underpinning our culture as it exists today. So like in Europe, for example, there is the history of like feudalism that was the former economic order that then got overturned. In the US, we are sort of an experiment or a laboratory for a country that starts with capitalism. So I think the combination of those two things led to this very strong sense that even our elite classes, our richest classes, the idea of them being truly successful is not purely them being leisurely, but it is also performing intense productivity, intense work, grind, all of that. And one of the things that this book in particular talks about is sort of even the rise of the concept of laziness, which I think rich people today, who probably technically don't have to work to have a completely comfortable lifestyle, there is this very deeply embedded sense of phobia of laziness that exists in the US, where even normal needed restful idleness is rebranded or construed as lazy, and that is something that is pretty universally reviled up and down class lines in the US. With that being said, let's talk a little bit more specifically about what I think this true success aesthetic looks like that does incorporate both effortless leisure, so that sort of Instagrammable or social media friendly vision of opulent vacations and spa days and buying fancy cars or whatever, like this effortless, expensive leisure that also includes opulence in your expression of consumerism that enables your leisure. It goes alongside of of this kind of grind culture. And I think that the vision of success is having it all, of being both very comfortable, affluent, able to buy whatever you want, able to do whatever you want, but still, I'm able to be lazy, but I don't choose to do that. I'm still on my grind. I'm still having startups. If I'm a CEO, I'm going in and making all of these big decisions and making bold moves and still getting up at 5 a.m. to sustain my fortune. It's this idea that work itself is a virtue, and I have earned my fortune through that work, and I have to continue that work to sustain my fortune. Even though the reality is the Zuckerbergs and the Musks and the whoever could never work another day in their life and still be wealthier than truly beyond even our ability to concretely conceptualize just how wealthy they are. I'll circle back around and talk a little bit more about that because I think they have to present that to kind of perpetuate this myth of what hard work results in, but it's sort of like dually important. It enforces a specific narrative that they need that benefits the overall sort of oligarchical structure that we have, but aside from that, it's also necessary for the sort of like saving you from the guillotine aspect, because there is contempt up and down class and money lines in the US, and I think also probably abroad, of this idea of people who are lazy or not being productive in some sense. There is a suspicion of a leisure class who is doing nothing productive to society. And there is this sort of fetishization, that word is always so hard for me, of productivity. People who inherit their money, for example, the critique or the sort of contempt that can come for those individuals if they do not work is not just the inherent potentially immorality of a system that allows that amount of wealth to pass from generation to generation, but it's also this contempt of the fact that they are not being productive members of society, whatever that means. You know, we're not going to go in this direction really fully in this video, but there has been a lot of really interesting philosophers around late and post-modernity talking about empty and hollow office work, for example, as sort of a microcosm of this hollow act of looking busy or looking productive. I can tell you that I have consulted for different businesses, and the number of office workers out there who are doing so little in their day-to-day jobs, but who have to perform this idea of busyness or perform this appearance of busyness is honestly very depressing and is a huge part. I know that there's been a lot of social media talk about why a lot of these uppity-ups want their workers to come into the office, and some of it is because they want to be able to observe them performing these workers' busyness, because so many of these office jobs really only require like 10 to 20 hours a week, but you are there for your full 40 or 45 or however much because it's a part of sort of the aesthetic of the position that the company has, is that everybody is trying to look busier than they actually are, which is very frustrating if you're one of the people who is actually fully busy for that full time. But there is so many people in office jobs who they spend so much of their time looking productive or looking busy, and that is a part of the sort of overall hollowness that people feel in getting any kind of meaning or value out of their day-to-day life at work. There's also just, I think, an overall productivity porn industry of social media. I've seen so many of these productivity YouTubers or productivity TikTokers around who are constantly talking about how to optimize your time, get the most out of your time, squeeze the most that you can out of time. There's this idea of wasting time being the ultimate evil, whereas the reality is everybody needs restful idleness, which I think is something that this book really drills home in a great way. We all need restful time to just kind of do nothing. It's good for our mental health, it's good for our physical health, and it's just a normal part of the ebb and flow of how humans get things done. But that has been so vilified, and there's this huge emphasis on being productive and also appearing productive. You know, I think that this plays into the whole like life hack substrate of online content. And I think that there's an insidious level of suspicion towards idleness that is honestly a reflection of insidious forces in our culture writ large. How do you have time to be idle if you are meeting the increased expectations of parenthood, for example. Parents are expected to be vastly more invested and hands-on with their children for both men and women, particularly women, but I think there's an increased expectation for men as well. If you consider how much time that takes for a parent to meet what is now considered to be the minimum expectation, there is sort of this implication of like, how do you have time to be idle if you are meeting those expectations? Also, the rise of the gig economy. There's so many people who, whether they want to or not, have to hustle and be constantly looking for more work. So how do you have time to rest if you aren't out there networking or taking another ride if you are working for Uber or Lyft or taking that extra freelance editing job or whatever? There's so many more gig type careers now that also I think encourages a suspicion of idleness. And just in general, I think that the kind of minimum expectations of adulthood have gone up a lot in the last few generations. You know, this is a good thing, but I think there's an expectation that adults are more emotionally and psychologically aware of themselves, and that they are also more aware of the world around them. Because of globalism, because of how we can see everything that's happening everywhere in the world because of the internet, there's an increased expectation externally that you are engaged with and participating in so many more things as opposed to, you know, joining your local neighborhood watch or being on the PTA. There's a huge sort of the expectation of being a good citizen, I think, of the world has gone up. And then there's also this, I think, increased pressure on having awareness and improving your emotional and psychological state. So I feel like what I called the minimums of adulthood have risen in the last couple of generations. So all in all, there's just a lot more expected of a given adult and child for that matter. I mean, we could go into a whole thing on the rise of like what it takes to get into a good college and the extracurricular expectations, et cetera, et cetera. It's like wild. But I think in general, there's just higher expectations of what everyone should be doing. And therefore it creates this suspicion of idleness because how do you have time for that? I know that's something that I have really had to confront with my autoimmune disease because I've kind of realized that if I'm working a full 5-day week, I almost certainly have to take a nearly full day to just rest on the weekend. And I think because I do BookTube, it's easier, like I can sort of mentally get myself to be more okay with that because I can read in bed and I can sort of make it feel like I'm still being productive. But that has been actually something that's made me really take a step back and think through, like, why do I feel the need to apologize that I have this certain need for rest? Just because of my human body that I have and that I need to take care of, like I have to rest. And why do I feel shame or guilt that that is something that I require? I also wanted to mention that I think that the success aesthetic has a gendered component to it. I'm going to talk more about a specific use case within women just because I think I'm more attuned to that since that is sort of culturally what is placed upon me. But I think for men, this often manifests in sort of grind culture stuff. So all of these different expectations around starting your own business, around investing. I think that there can be some gendered grind culture expectations on men. For women, I think a specific use case that plays into something we'll talk about more later are MLMs. I was specifically thinking about this sort of success aesthetic for women when I was watching the documentary Lula Rich, which is about the LuLaRoe MLM. There was a lot of things that I thought in that particular documentary, but some of the things that I wrote down that kind of played into what was projected as being successful within that company is one, there's a physical aesthetic expectation for women who are successful because it's not good enough for you to be materially successful. You also have to be successful as a wife, as a mother, and then you also have to achieve a certain physical look. You need to be conventionally attractive. That is a part of the success aesthetic, which in that particular use case is embodied with the fact that so many of the people were pressured into going and getting their stomachs reduced in size in Tijuana. So like there's that whole aspect of it. There's the whole girl boss, boss babe version of female empowerment that I think can be a part of the success aesthetic for women. There's been a lot of videos, I think, sort of debunking the rise of the boss babe vibe in the 2010s. So I'll try to remember to link some of those videos. But I think that whole image is being critiqued now as being very hollow. And I think it's because it has this certain performativity vibe that it has over actual substance. The other thing that made a note of when I was watching that documentary is this idea that they're constantly talking about how they'd rather be broke than work for someone else, really idealizing this idea of having your own business so you don't have to work for someone else and so that you can spend more time with your kids. Because this particularly, I think, is playing into a lot of the fears or sort of pressures, social pressures, women, particularly military wives or stay-at-home moms, have around their performance of their role within their family. I think that a lot of MLMs kind of play on that, where I think that it sort of reveals that it's more about the idea or the idealized vision of that being, I want my life to look like that, is that the reality of owning your own small business is that it is incredibly time consuming. It is so much more work, I would argue, to own your own business than it is to work for someone else. Yes, you don't have the same sort of time pressures often, but that's not even true, especially if you have like a customer-based small business, or if you have all this fulfillment that you have to do for your small business. That takes so much time. And so this idea that, oh, I'm going to be making all this money and I'm going to be the boss of my own time is sort of just ignoring the reality of you're never wholly beholden to only yourself. The only way that happens is if you are truly independently wealthy and have achieved a level of success that means that you don't even have to work. If you have to work, there is some level of constraint or imposition on your time, on your preferences, etc. Like, that is the nature of having to work. So they're selling this vision of, oh, you'll be the master of your own time and therefore you can take all of this time you're saving and put that towards being with your kids. Okay, maybe, but maybe you're going to be spending your evenings when your husband gets home packaging up all of the things that you sold that day or going on Instagram Live or whatever. Like, there is this sort of false promise of less work with owning your own business when the reality is kind of the opposite. So anyway, I feel like the whole MLM scheme, like the whole hollowness of that business model, is really just like the natural endpoint of an idea of success that is not attainable and is mostly based on idealized versions of the way work could work, as opposed to the realities imposed by macro cultural and economic forces. We talked a lot about how I think there's a lot of cultural pressures on having people aspire to labor, which is part of why that saying of I do not aspire to labor feels so transgressive to me. We've kind of addressed why that feels transgressive, but now I kind of want to start talking through, should it be transgressive? Is work ethical? We talk about this idea of work ethic. Is work a virtue? Is it a good thing to be a hard worker, etc.? So I think we have to start by talking about work that you do for money versus unpaid labor. So let's start with work that we do for money. One thing that I've become more aware of in the last couple of years is the fact that under capitalism, really as a worker, your incentive is to try to get the most from a job while giving the least back to it. So what do I mean by that? I was talking earlier about office work. There is an offset of incentives because if you are salaried, or even if you just are there if you get paid by the hour, if you're getting paid for a unit of time rather than a specific output, it behooves you to do the least amount of work that you possibly can to get the same agreed to amount of remuneration. That is the employee's incentives or the worker's incentives. The workplace's incentive is to try to coerce you or prod your workforce into doing as much as you can possibly get them to do for the least amount of money. So you essentially have two competing forces. Now, what would be a very effective way to try to goad your workforce into doing more work just from their own personal incentives rather than you having to punish them? Well, having a workforce that has been thoroughly bought into the idea that working hard or having a work ethic is a virtue would certainly help that. So that gets into what I was talking about earlier, that there is sort of a dual reason why I think a lot of these hyper rich billionaire CEOs perform the grind. It's because it behooves them for their workforce to see them continuing to work hard, because it reiterates the cultural messaging that you are more virtuous or you are better if you work hard. So if you have a cultural inculcation that treats hard work as a moral imperative, you've gotten a lot of, like for instance, me and my Virgo moon, I want to perform. I want to follow the rules. And if I am thoroughly indoctrinated from a young age that the rules are you need to give your all at everything you do, well, there's a reason why I'm always a top performer, because I struggle to be somebody who can do less for the same amount of money that I would be getting otherwise. I think is a big part of why we have been indoctrinated as such. I think both of these books touch on that a lot. The other reason why I think you have to try to instill in your workforce a grind mentality, a productivity mentality, is that if you give them enough time for idleness and rest, it gives them time for reflection. If you give people time to really evaluate what's important to them and what they really want very well could not align with what it is their workplaces really want. I think that we have seen a very direct example of this because of the pandemic and the subsequent Great Resignation. Now, some of that were people who had time to reflect and realize that they wanted to change career paths. Some of that was people seeing how little their workplace valued their health and safety, and sort of out of a place of imperative for their own sense of imminent well-being, felt like they had to change careers. But then there were also people, for instance, a good chunk of the Great Resignation were boomers who were sort of approaching retirement age, finally being forced to take things slower and realizing that they actually wouldn't mind being retired. And so finally going ahead and doing that. In general, it behooves the workplace to have a workforce who is in the grind, in the day-to-day, is too busy to actually take a step back and look up and potentially organize a union, which is definitely something that we've seen coming out of the pandemic, to decide that they want to change career paths, to realize that they have enough power or enough skill in their position that they can command a higher wage, or that they can find a better position somewhere else. Finally having enough time to breathe, to put that resume together and do the work of finding a different job. It doesn't behoove your workplace basically for you to have time to rest, aside from whatever minimal rest is required in order for you to optimally function for them for however many hours a week you're supposed to be working. And I think that there's also this growing awareness of just how hollow some of this forced productivity is. And it's ironically from some of the people who I think are most invested in the American dream, the kind of capitalistic promise, because I think that this is where you see the obsession with passive income coming from. This idea that I should try to minimize the amount of time that I'm actually spending on a task, because most of that time is not value add, and really what I'm trying to get to is the money. So these people who are very fixated on how many passive income streams can I create, because really the value of work that goes into a lot of our income generation is pretty low. So how can you sort of like cut out the BS of sitting around in the office for 20 hours that you don't need to be, and instead turn that into time where you can be generating money through a different stream? I feel like this is sort of the paradox of the grind culture, and you can kind of see this in MLM and in NFT scams. Is that too harsh? But anyway, this idea of constantly trying to get more people under you to outsource the work underneath you, because you know that that work is actually not that big of a value add. Really, all of the money flows to the top. So how can you put yourself in the position to be at the top and have everything else be happening passively for you so that you can pursue more streams of income? So that is all paid work. The other piece of this is unpaid labor, and labor that is historically completely unvalued in most societies because they are usually done by women and or people of lower castes. But these are the unpaid care tasks that are necessary to keep the wheels of life moving. This is the laundry, this is cleaning the house, this is doing the dishes, this is caring for the sick, this is caring for children. There is a very strong drive to keep these tasks as unpaid and unvalued, because what is instilled is this idea that they are about being responsible or what a loving whatever would do. This particularly becomes gendered, right? So like a lot of this is put on women, and then if a family reaches a certain level of affluence, it's then outsourced to lower caste women. often in the US that would be women of color or immigrant women, there is definitely a huge resistance to, for instance, allowing those kinds of workers to unionize and demand better conditions, because we are able to put this narrative around them that the hard work that is put into them should be free, and if somebody demands payment for it, it should only be somebody who's doing that as a last resort and therefore who will take a low wage. Work Won't Love You Back, this has a lot of, I think, really thought-provoking stuff around care tasks and care work that is expected to be unpaid and what happens to the people who do get paid to do them. What are their conditions like? Okay, and then I had like a sidebar here about gender roles, so I'm just gonna read this because I think I said this the way that I wanted to say it here. Gender roles have not fully realigned to working realities, which drives discontent for both men and women. During the family wage era, so this is sort of the like bygone era where a man could make enough money through paid labor that would sustain the woman not necessarily having to do paid labor, doing the labor around the house. During the family wage era, men expressed their powerlessness towards their employers by potentially abusing women. So that's why, in part, I think why domestic abuse was much more common and normalized in those societies, is that in that sort of direct hierarchy, men would experience abuse externally from broader cultural forces, and then really the only avenue they had to express their own powerlessness if they were not high up in the hierarchy would be to take it out on their women and children. So that would be historically a position men would find themselves in. But I think with the redefinition of gender roles in society writ large and what masculinity even means, and this is something eventually I'll probably do a video on, this idea that many men are very torn about how to think about women as fellow wage earners who may or may not be willing to take on all of the unpaid care tasks. So I think you see this a lot on TikTok where there's men with podcasts, which that's a whole subgenre of TikTok, is men with microphones and people yelling at men with microphones.
Sir, you are in women's business. Here is you, okay? And between your business, you got men TikTok, you got the female hating TikTok, you got ESPN and a job, and yet you choose to be in women's business.
But anyway, if you watch what they say, they're constantly being torn between castigating women for being gold diggers or for being like a man if they have to work. So if they don't want to work, if they want to focus on being an unpaid caregiver in the home, they are torn down for being gold diggers. But if they also want to be wage earners, if they want to take on a role outside of the home, then it's seen as unfeminine, as trying to not have a place for a man in their life. It's very dichotomized in a way that's telling of just the kind of flux state that I think we're in for a lot of men and how they conceptualize their gender performance in the world. But I think for women are told that they have to have it all. And that includes being judged if they rely on a man. I think women who choose or would like to be unpaid caregivers in their home are very heavily, I think, judged by society for that. And I think that that's really unfair. Like, I think if you want to be and you are able to be a stay-at-home mom and do that kind of unpaid caregiving, that is like a huge job and deserves to be respected, and I think frankly deserves to be remunerated by the rest of society. But anyway, so you get judged if that's the path you want to take. Either way, you're going to be unable to meet these increasingly high expectations of motherhood. But if you work in particular, you're going to be expected to fulfill all of the things that a full-time unpaid caregiver could do, but also bringing home a wage. And if you are working outside the home, you are also likely going to be discriminated against in some degree in your workplace. You may have a lower wage than your male colleagues, etc. So I put all this here of like, I think that the gender role aspect of unpaid caregiving work is a lot, and I think complicates this overall message that people have about working hard, because it's assumed to be career oriented in the 2020s, but the reality is it's hard work in all areas of your life, whether or not you are getting paid for that work, and you are expected to be highly productive and to not have idleness at work and at home. So the expectation is whether or not you are actually getting paid for work, there is a social expectation that you are working hard all the time in all areas of your life. Idle restfulness is not not a piece of the equation really anywhere. But I think, so to try to answer the question, is work ethical or is hard work a good thing? I think even though it's so baked into me that it is, I really want to tell myself and tell other people that hard work in and of itself is morally neutral. I think that part of the narrative that we have is almost that we're all collectively working on a group project, and if you are not a hard worker, you're the freeloader in the group project who just, I don't know, like has to print off the slides before the group presentation, and the two people who did all of the work are unfairly getting burdened. And yes, that dynamic can certainly exist in any given workplace, and I do think it's like unkind and potentially unethical to purposely direct work only towards one or two of your coworkers. The reality is the person who the onus should be to do all the work is the workplace, this nebulous organization that is made up of upper management. Like, they're the ones ultimately who benefit the most from you going above and beyond and pulling your weight in the group project. And I don't feel an ethical compulsion to make upper management's life better, because they're getting paid hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to do that work. And they should, for that much money, they should be doing more work. So I think I'm trying to reframe that for myself, away from feeling like I'm the freeloader group project person if I don't work hard at something, and more to just stay in my lane and focus on what I know needs to be done for my job, and not to take on unpaid additional work just because I want to be a hard worker. I don't know if any of that made sense, but that's kind of where I've been talking to myself about, that work itself is morally neutral. That's something, I follow Domestic Blisser on TikTok, and I read her little book, which I think is actually really, really helpful. But one of the things that she's reiterating in this is this idea of that care tasks and care work being morally neutral. And I think that that's something important to bring to, yes, care tasks around the home. I think particularly femme presenting and women people need to internalize some of those lessons, because there is this cultural expectation of shame and guilt if you are not on top of that. It is, care tasks are not seen as morally neutral. But I think that we can bring that same energy to all work, be it paid or unpaid. Work itself is not ethical or unethical. It is just a requirement at this point in human development to maintain life. And I think that we should try to do as little of it as we can to maintain whatever quality of life we want. I think restful idleness and leisure are good. Those are good. I feel like hard work in and of itself is neutral to bad. And look, oh, I had a Marple. I was changing my battery, and Marple was all snuggled up, but now she's gone because some jerk just yelled outside and scared her. Anyway, probably wrap this up considering my camera keeps telling me it's about to overheat. I think basically where I was trying to land off is that you can either like or not like work, that's fine. But there's not a moral imperative to enjoy work and to love it and to want to do more of it. I don't think that that is a virtue or intrinsically morally good. Now, do I think it's great where you can enjoy work of all kinds? Yeah, like I think that that makes life more pleasant. Let's take an example of cleaning and two different completely valid perspectives on it. One is from this book I was talking about. Basically, she's going through and kind of talking about how complicated it is to execute cleaning around your home and how much skill it actually involves. So she says, cleaning is an ongoing task made up of hundreds of small skills that must be practiced every day at the right time and manner in order to keep going on the business of life. First, you must have the executive functioning to deal with sequentially ordering and prioritizing tasks. You must learn which cleaning must be done daily and which can be done on a different interval. You must remember those intervals. You must be familiar with cleaning products and remember to purchase them. You must have the physical energy and time to complete these tasks and the mental energy to engage in a low dopamine errand for an extended period of time. You must possess the faculties to process any sensory discomfort that comes from dealing with any dirty or soiled materials. Just clean as you go. Sounds good and nice, but most people do not appreciate the hundreds of skills it takes to operate that way and the thousands of barriers that can interfere with learning or executing these skills properly. So I think that's one approach of like, hey, this is really hard and it's okay. You know, this whole book is basically, here are ways to cope with care tasks that may be necessary, how to, as it says, keep house while drowning. Like that this is purely on a survival level, something you don't enjoy, but something you may have to do. Whereas I also recently read a book called Laundry Love, and it was basically just a love letter to how much this guy enjoys the chore or the work task, the care task of doing laundry, and why he finds joy in it and how to do it well, and going into all the nitty-gritty of some of those skills that she was talking about that you need to do laundry well. You know, you can approach any given work task with enjoyment or with non-enjoyment, and either is, I guess where I'm trying to get to, is morally neutral. It's fine. I try to enjoy errands and chores wherever I can because it makes it more pleasant for me, but I also have certain things that I just really hate. Like, for instance, when my cats puke, I have a very sensitive gag reflex to it, and it is very difficult for me to, on a sensory level, clean that up. And I often will delay doing it, and then I feel guilt about it, but it is what it is. I don't have a way to enjoy cleaning up my cat's puke, and that's okay. If you can't find a way to enjoy, you know, cleaning a dirty diaper or cleaning hair out of this, all of that stuff, like, you don't have to love it, but if there are ways to enjoy things that you have to do for work, so if you have a profession that you're really passionate about, and hey, let's face it, people who are in a lot of these care professions, like teaching or nursing, must have a genuine love for it to put up with the amount of BS that they do. You can approach your profession or career from a place of passion and love. That is totally valid, but it is also totally valid to work purely from a mechanistic, or I put in X number of hours and then I clock out and go home and try not to think about it until I come back. That is also a completely morally valid approach. You can be somebody who doesn't mind going above and beyond and, you know, putting in extra time because you enjoy the task. Maybe you're somebody who really loves dealing with spreadsheets. I work in a finance department. I know a lot of these people, and maybe they enjoy going above and beyond to come up with like pivot tables or querying in a database in a more efficient way or whatever. Like, there are people who really enjoy that and they get pleasure out of a job well done. I think that that's great. It's also fine if you happen to be good at that, but you don't like it, and you can get paid well to do something that you don't like. All of that is morally neutral, and working hard at any of those things is your choice and is morally neutral. All that to say, for me, thinking some of this through has helped me challenge some of my own preconceptions about the way that I'm performing what my work life is like for others. I think especially because I'm a single woman and because I am in a profession that could be considered like a career profession, I feel this sort of intrinsic pressure or underlying assumption from people that I'm very career focused, and that means that I want to work long hours and I'm trying to climb the ladder. And I think that this has helped me realize that often some of that is stuff I'm performing, and the reality is my job is fine. I like my job okay. I wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't a very well-paid profession, because it's not something I have a passion for. And I am not looking to put in a bunch of extra hours that I'm not getting paid for, and that I don't have to perform. I mean, maybe I have to perform that in my workplace, which gets into a whole other area of philosophizing around emotional labor, etc. But at least outside of the workforce, like just in my day-to-day life, I don't need to perform that I have some sort of passion to be a career woman. I like leisure. I like to be able to afford my health insurance. I like to be able to spoil my kitties and give them the life that I think they deserve. And so that is why I do the job I do. It's not because I have some aspiration to be a career woman, and that's fine. Like, I think thinking through this has helped me sort of deconstruct that image that I feel a pressure to project and realize that I just don't care about it. I'm gonna stop pretending that I care about it. And also just that I am gonna do my best to stop commending people for being a hard worker, because while I don't think it's bad to be a hard worker, I also think that this kind of focus on that as a virtue perpetuates a lot of systems of harm that I am not on board with. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know kind of what your relationship with work is, I guess, what you thought of anything that I was talking about today. Like I said, this is both an entry in my aesthetics series, but also a kind of precursor to what I'm hoping will be a video about sort of leftism and why that I think is resonating so much with particularly younger people in the last decade. So this is sort of a precursor to that. But let me know what you thought about any of this below. If you enjoyed the video, like it, hit the bell for notifications, subscribe, do all those things if you want to see more. And yeah, I guess that will do it for me. Myself, Marple, and my other cat, who is right behind the camera, are sending you good wishes, and I hope you guys have a great day wherever you are. I'll talk to you later. Bye.